My neighbor reported me to the HOA every week for a year. Then I joined the board. She came to the next meeting and froze when she saw my name. The meeting was called to order at 7:03 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. I know the exact time because I was the one who called it. I was sitting at the folding table at the front of the Ridgecrest Community Center, a beige room with fluorescent lighting and a water-stained drop ceiling that the HOA had been reviewing options for since 2019, with a printed agenda in front of me, a gavel I had never used and intended never to use, and the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a specific moment to arrive. The room was fuller than usual, 26 residents, which is approximately 22 more than the average monthly attendance. Word had gotten out that there was something on the agenda worth seeing. There were folding chairs in 3 rows, a card table with a coffee urn nobody touched, and the particular ambient tension of a neighborhood that had been taking sides for 14 months. She came in at 7:04, Linda Castellano, 61 years old, retired school administrator, owner of a meticulously maintained craftsman-style home at 14 Ridgecrest Lane, directly across the cul-de-sac from mine. She was wearing a blazer. She had a legal pad. She had the expression of a woman who was prepared to speak. She saw the agenda on the sign-in table. Standard practice. We print one for each attendee. Her name was on it, under item 4, resident concern, El Castellano, ongoing compliance issues. Then she looked up and saw me at the front table, and the legal pad went slack in her hand. I did not smile. I have never been a man who smiles at the wrong moment. I just looked back at her, the way you look at someone when you've been thinking about this exact moment for 14 months, and then I looked back down at my agenda. Welcome, everyone, I said. Let's get started. I'd been living at 12 Ridgecrest Lane for 3 years when it started. I moved in during the fall of 2020. Me, my toolbox, a 2018 Ford F-150 that I use for work, and approximately 60 boxes that took me 3 weekends to fully unpack. I'm a residential contractor. I own a small operation. 4 guys, including me, doing kitchen and bathroom remodels across the greater Sacramento area. I'm 41 years old. I've been doing this since I was 23, and I have the particular set of skills that comes from spending 2 decades looking at structures and understanding exactly what's wrong with them. I bought the Ridgecrest house specifically because it needed work. Not structural, nothing dangerous, but it had been neglected for years. Dated kitchen, cracked driveway, landscaping that had given up on itself somewhere around the Obama administration. I got it for $340,000 in a neighborhood where similar houses were going for $410,000 because the listing photos looked like a crime scene, and I was the only buyer who saw it differently. I spent the first year fixing it. Nights, weekends, whatever time I had. New kitchen cabinets. Installed them myself, obviously. Resurfaced the driveway. Tore out the dead landscaping and put in drought-resistant plants. Decomposed granite. 2 Japanese maples that I am unreasonably proud of. By the end of year 1, my house was the nicest-looking property on the cul-de-sac, by a margin that I'm mentioning not to brag, but because it's relevant to everything that follows. Linda Castellano lived directly across from me. She'd been there for 15 years. She was on the HOA board as the compliance and standards representative, and she had, at some point before I arrived, become the unofficial arbiter of what was and wasn't acceptable on Ridgecrest Lane. I know this because within 2 weeks of moving in, 3 separate neighbors warned me about her in tones that suggested they were sharing information they found personally valuable. She's got eyes on every house, my neighbor Tom Brewer told me, over his fence one afternoon. Tom was a retired electrician in his late 60s who kept his yard immaculate and his opinions measured. You do anything she doesn't like, you'll hear about it. Not from her, from the HOA. I thanked him. I told myself I'd be respectful, keep things clean, no problems. That lasted about 6 weeks. The first notice arrived on a Monday morning in November 2021. Formal letter, Ridgecrest HOA letterhead, signed by the property management company, Apex Community Solutions, on behalf of the board. It cited Section 7.3 of the CC&Rs. No recreational vehicles, commercial vehicles, or equipment shall be stored in driveways or visible from the street for extended periods. My F-150 had a magnetic sign on the door. Keen contracting, residential renovations. I'd had it for 6 years. It was my truck. I parked it in my own driveway. I looked up Section 7.3. The actual text said, no recreational vehicles or commercial vehicles used primarily for business purposes shall be parked in residential driveways as primary overnight storage. My truck was not being stored. It was parked. There's a legal distinction, and also a common sense one, and I wrote a brief, polite response explaining that my vehicle was personal transportation that I used for work, not a commercial vehicle being stored on the property. I cited 2 comparable HOA rulings from California case law that I found in about 40 minutes of research. The notice was withdrawn. I told myself it was a miscommunication. I told myself the system was working correctly. I told myself it was done. It was not done. 4 weeks later, a second notice. This one cited Section 12.1. All landscaping must be maintained in a neat and presentable condition consistent with community standards. My Japanese maple maples were, apparently, not consistent with community standards. Specifically, they had been planted asymmetrically. One was 8 inches further from the property line than the other, and someone had measured, and the decomposed granite walkway did not conform to the community's approved materials list, a document I had never been given and which, when I requested it, turned out not to exist in any written form. I requested a variance. This required a written application, 2 neighbor signatures, and a $30 fee. I submitted all of it. I also included photographs of 6 other properties in the neighborhood that had decomposed granite, including one that had been installed the previous year by a board member named Gary Purcell without any apparent variance application. The variance was approved. The notice was withdrawn. I told myself this was bureaucracy. Slow, cumbersome, impersonal. I told myself Linda Castellano was probably just doing her job, and I had caught some legitimate attention during the renovations. Third notice, January. My Christmas lights were still up on January 8th. Section 9.4 specified that seasonal decorations must be removed within 14 days of the holiday. Christmas is December 25th. January 8th was day 14. The notice was sent, time-stamped, at 6:47 a.m. Someone had been counting. I took the lights down that morning. I did not respond to the notice. Fourth notice, February. My recycling bins had been left at the curb for 6 hours after collection. I'd been on a job site, hadn't gotten home until 7 p.m. Collection was at noon. Section 11.2 specified bins must be removed within 4 hours of collection. By this point, I had a folder on my desk labeled HOA. It had dividers. I had become a man with a tabbed folder system for neighbor complaints, which was not something I'd ever anticipated for myself. I want to be precise about the timeline because I think it matters. Between November 2021 and November 2022, I received 47 formal notices from the Ridgecrest HOA, 47, in 12 months. That's almost one per week, with a few gaps when I assume Linda was traveling or had other priorities. I know they came from Linda because, starting with the 5th or 6th notice, I began paying attention to patterns. Notices arrived on Monday mornings. Notices always cited something observable from the street. Notices always used specific measurements or timestamps that indicated close, regular observation. And on 3 occasions, I caught her, not doing anything dramatic, just standing at her kitchen window with a clear sight line to my property. Once at 6:30 a.m. on a Saturday, once from her front porch with what appeared to be her phone raised at a slight angle, once in her car, parked at the end of the cul-de-sac, engine off. I did not confront her. My father, who built custom homes for 40 years and dealt with every variety of difficult person the industry produces, gave me advice early in my career that I've thought about many times since. Never pick a fight you can't finish. Finish the ones you can't avoid. I wasn't ready to finish this one yet. I was still gathering information. The financial costs started adding up in ways I hadn't anticipated. Notice 21 cited a crack in my driveway, the same driveway I had resurfaced 18 months earlier that had appeared after a particularly cold January. I was required to repair it within 30 days or face a fine of $75 per day. The crack was 8 inches long and a 1/4 inch wide. I repaired it. The repair cost me a half day of labor and materials I already had on hand. Notice 33 cited my fence. Section 14.7, fencing height restrictions. My fence was 6 feet tall. The maximum was 6 feet. Someone had measured it and reported it as approximately 6.5 feet. I hired a licensed surveyor named Dale Hutchinson, who had been in the business for 28 years, to measure my fence at 11 different points. The highest point was 5 feet, 11 inches. I submitted the survey with a written response. The fine was rescinded. Notice 38 was the one that changed things. It cited Section 18. 2. No business operations shall be conducted from residential properties, including storage of materials, equipment, or vehicles used in commercial enterprise. Attached to the notice was a photograph. My driveway, taken from across the street, showing my truck and a small flatbed trailer I'd parked there for a weekend while I did a materials run. The trailer had Keen Contracting painted on the side. The proposed fine was $500 plus $100 per day. I read that number twice. Something shifted in me. Not anger exactly. I'd had plenty of that. Something colder and more specific. I called an attorney. Her name was Rebecca Solis. She had 14 years in property and HOA law after clerking for the Sacramento County Superior Court, and her office was in Midtown in a building that also housed a yoga studio, which created an interesting atmospheric contrast. She was 43, methodical, and had the specific quality of listening that lawyers develop when they've spent years watching people get into trouble by talking past each other. She reviewed my folder. It took her 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes of my watching a professional read through 14 months of my life. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me. "This is targeted harassment," she said. "Not legally, not yet, not without more documentation, but functionally. The pattern is specific, sustained, and disproportionate. 47 notices in 12 months is not compliance monitoring. It's a campaign. Can I do anything about it? A few things. First, you should be documenting everything on your end. Photographs of your property at regular intervals. Timestamps. Any observations of the person you believe is filing these reports." She paused. "Second, and this is the thing I'd actually recommend, you should look look at the HOA's governing documents. I've read them. I mean, beyond the CC&Rs, the bylaws, who's on the board, how board seats are filled, when elections are held. I looked at her. Ridgecrest is a self-governed HOA, she said. The board has 5 seats. Based on what you've shown me, the compliance and standards representative has essentially been weaponizing the complaint process without any meaningful check from the other board members. The question I'd ask is, why isn't anyone checking her? I drove home and read the bylaws cover to cover. Board seats were filled by election. Annual elections in September. Any homeowner in good standing, meaning current on HOA dues, no outstanding violations, could run. I had no outstanding violations. Every notice had been resolved. My dues were paid through the following March. I was in good standing. I want to be honest about the moment I decided, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a montage. I was sitting at my kitchen table at 9:15 p.m. on a Wednesday in January, eating leftover pasta, reading the bylaw section on board eligibility for the 3rd time, and I thought I could fix this. Not just for me. For Tom Brewer, who'd maintained his yard to perfection for 20 years and still walked carefully around the edges of what Linda might consider reportable. For the Nguyens at number 8, who'd gotten a notice about their vegetable garden being agriculturally inconsistent with community character. For the 34 other families on Ridgecrest Lane who had, in varying degrees, arranged their home lives around the preferences of one woman with too much time and an official title. I filed my candidacy paperwork the next morning. The September election had 4 open seats. Linda Castellano was running for re-election to her compliance and standards seat. Gary Purcell, the long-tenured treasurer, was running again. 2 other incumbents, and me. I introduced myself as a residential contractor with professional experience in property standards, building codes, and community guidelines. I knocked on 29 doors over 3 weekends. I brought a printed one-pager with my background and 3 specific policy proposals. A formal written approved materials list that residents could reference before making any changes, a mandatory review period for any notice before it was sent, and a cap on the number of notices that could be filed against any single property in a 60-day period without board review. I did not mention Linda Castellano by name anywhere in my materials. I didn't need to. Of the 4 open seats, I received the 2nd highest vote total, 47 votes, which I appreciated for reasons that were entirely personal. I joined the board in October. I was assigned the role of vice president, which meant I sat at the front table and called meetings to order when the president, a retired engineer named Bob Stratton, who'd been in the role for 6 years and had the energy of a man deeply tired of all of it, needed to step away. Bob was 68, fair-minded, and had spent the past year being quietly uncomfortable with the volume of notices coming out of Linda's compliance reports without fully knowing what to do about it. When I joined the board, he spent our first one-on-one conversation asking me careful questions about my background, and then saying, "I think you're going to be useful here," with the tone of a man who meant something specific by it. I reviewed 14 months of compliance records. All the notices, all the fine proposals, all the outcomes. I built a spreadsheet, of course I did, and I color-coded it. 1 column for the complainant, 1 for the property cited, 1 for the outcome. The patterns were immediate and undeniable. Of the 47 notices filed against my property in 12 months, 44 had been initiated by a single source. Complaint forms submitted through the HOA's online portal from an account registered to Linda Castellano's home address. The other 3 had come from the property management company as follow-up to her original reports. She had filed 44 complaints about 1 house. I brought this, with the spreadsheet printed and tabbed, to Bob Stratton on a Thursday morning in his kitchen, over coffee. He looked at it for a long time. "I didn't know it was this concentrated," he said. "The system doesn't flag volume," I said. "It processes each complaint individually. There was no mechanism to see the aggregate. What do you want to do?" "I want to bring it to the full board, transparently, at the next open meeting." Bob looked at his coffee. "She's going to fight it. I know. She's been on this board for 7 years. She knows everyone. I know that too." He looked up at me. He had the eyes of a man who had been waiting for someone else to pick up a weight he'd been circling for a long time. "Put it on the agenda," he said. "I want to tell you about the 2 weeks before the October meeting, because they were not comfortable weeks. Word got around. It always does, in a neighborhood that size. People who'd known me for 3 years started calling, some to offer support, some to ask carefully worded questions that were really asking whose side I was on. Linda Castellano's name appeared in my phone 3 times. She called once and texted twice. I didn't answer the call. The texts were formal and bureaucratic, asking me to clarify the agenda item before the meeting. I responded in writing. The agenda item is a review of complaint volume data from the past 14 months and a discussion of proposed policy amendments. All relevant documentation will be provided to board members and available to residents at the meeting. She did not respond. I also received, on the Thursday before the meeting, a notice. New notice. My truck, parked in my driveway. My magnetic sign, still on the door. Section 7.3 again, as if we were starting over, as if the previous 2 years hadn't happened. I photographed it. Photographed my truck, photographed the notice, added it to the folder, which now had 4 tabbed sections and a cover page with a case number I'd assigned myself. herself. Rebecca Solis, when I told her, laughed, not unkindly. She's panicking, she said. People who panic make records. That notice is evidence of the pattern, not proof against you. I know. How are you feeling? I thought about it. Like a man who's been doing the math for 14 months and finally has all the numbers. The meeting. 7:03 p.m. 26 residents. Coffee urn. Folding chairs. Water-stained ceiling. Linda walked in at 7:04 with her legal pad and her blazer and the expression of a woman prepared for combat. Saw the agenda. Saw me. The legal pad went slack. I called the meeting to order. We moved through items 1, 2, and 3. Routine business, minutes from the previous meeting, treasurer's report, and then I introduced item 4. At this time, I'd like to present a data review of HOA complaint activity from November 2021 through November 2022, prepared by myself and reviewed by Board President Bob Stratton. I had printed 30 copies. I handed them to Bob, who passed them down the rows. The document was 8 pages. Page 1 was a summary. Pages 2 through 7 were the complaint log, organized chronologically, with the property cited, the section referenced, the outcome, and this is the part I want you to understand, was completely, factually accurate and required no editorializing. The name of the complainant as recorded in the HOA's own online portal system. Page 8 was a bar graph I had built in Excel. It showed complaint volume by source, anonymized except for one bar, the tallest one, by a significant margin, which was labeled with the portal account number that was registered to 14 Ridgecrest Lane. I didn't say her name. I didn't need to. Every person in that room knew who lived at 14 Ridgecrest Lane. I'm presenting this, I said, not as an accusation, but as a basis for a policy discussion. The board has an obligation to ensure that the compliance reporting system is used for its intended purpose, community standards, and not in a way that constitutes targeted harassment of individual residents. I'd like to discuss 3 proposed amendments. I went through the amendments, the written materials list, the mandatory review period, the volume cap. Then I opened the floor for comment. Linda Castellano stood up. She had composed herself. I'll give her that. The legal pad was back in her hands, and she had notes on it, and her voice was controlled. I want to state for the record that every complaint I filed was based on genuine observed violations of the CCNRs. That's noted, I said. And you'll see in the data that the majority of those notices were either withdrawn or not sustained, which is exactly why we're discussing a review period. This is a personal attack. This is a spreadsheet, I said. The data was compiled from the HOA's own record system. Every figure in it is verifiable. If there are errors, I'd welcome correction. She looked at the document in her hand, then at me, then at the room. Tom Brewer from row 2 said quietly, I got 6 notices last year. Same thing happened to the Nguyens. Someone else. We got 4. A woman in the back, I didn't know her, she was from the far end of the community, Zaim said. I stopped putting out my planters because I was afraid of getting a letter. The room had a quality to it then. Not angry. Something more complicated than anger. The particular atmosphere of a group of people realizing simultaneously that the thing they'd each thought was happening only to them had been happening to all of them. Linda Castellano sat down. The board voted on the 3 proposed amendments. 4 in favor, 1 abstention. The abstention was Linda. Bob Stratton, after the vote, said, I'd also like to note for the record that the board will be conducting a formal review of complaint filing practices and the appropriate use of the compliance system. That review will be completed before the December meeting. He didn't look at Linda when he said it. He didn't need to. The review was completed in November. Rebecca Solis, who I'd retained to advise the board during the process, submitted a formal legal memo, 7 pages dated November 15, 2023, that outlined the relevant California statutes on HOA governance, the legal definition of harassing conduct in the context of homeowner associations, and the board's liability exposure if the pattern of complaints was found to constitute targeted discrimination under Civil Code Section 4515. That's the part of California law that prohibits HOAs from using their authority to intimidate or retaliate against homeowners. The memo wasn't public, but its existence was. Linda Castellano did not run for re-election in the following September. She resigned from the Compliance and Standards seat in February, citing personal reasons in an email to the full board that I read on a Tuesday morning while drinking coffee in the kitchen of a house I'd rebuilt with my own hands. The 47 notices, all 47 of them, were expunged from my property record as part of the policy review, as if they had never existed. They had existed, but the record no longer said so. Tom Brewer came over the weekend after the October meeting. He brought 2 beers and stood in my driveway looking at the Japanese maples, which had grown into themselves beautifully by then. Those are good trees, he said. Thanks. Took about 2 years. He nodded. She called me last night, he said. Linda. Said you'd been gunning for her since you moved in. Said you'd manipulated the whole thing. I waited. I told her I'd watched you respond to 47 notices in 12 months without once raising your voice. He took a sip of his beer. Then I hung up. I looked at my maples. Asymmetrically planted. 8 inches apart. Exactly as I'd intended. Perfectly inconsistent. Perfectly mine. You want to sit out here for a while? I asked. Yeah, he said. I do. The Nguyens planted a vegetable garden the following spring. Full-size, raised beds, tomatoes and peppers, and something leafy I couldn't identify that turned out to be several varieties of Vietnamese herbs. They didn't ask for a variance. The new guidelines didn't require one for vegetable gardens under 40 square feet. I watched them plant it from my front porch one Saturday morning. Their daughter, who was maybe 9 years old, was helping. She was putting seedlings in with the focused seriousness of a child who has been trusted with something that matters. The family across the street, the house that used to be the eyes of the cul-de-sac, had their blinds closed. I picked up my coffee. I went inside. I had a kitchen remodel to quote on Monday and a board meeting to prepare for on Tuesday, and the sun was coming up over the roofline of a neighborhood that had, very quietly, started to breathe again. The Nguyen's daughter patted dirt around a seedling with both hands. That was enough. That was exactly enough.